Hi everyone, Alexa Donne here, and today I am kind of continuing to talk about retellings. I did a video on what makes a good retelling. I will link that down below if you want to catch that, though you can watch these in any order, but they do kind of go together. And today I'm talking about how to choose the right story to retell and some of the things that you want to keep in mind when you are approaching a retelling from a legal point of view. So first up, when you are thinking that you want to do a retelling, you need to ask yourself why you want to do a retelling. What is it that you hope to achieve? And always ask yourself, is what you really want to do is to write fan fiction? Now, there's nothing wrong with writing fan fiction. I love fan fiction. I am super pro fan fiction. I've also got a video on that you can watch. I will also link that down below. But here's the thing, for a lot of media properties, if you want to retell them, you really want to write fan fiction instead, because many media properties, you can't retell them because they are too current, they are under copyright, and a whole host of other reasons. So for example, I've seen a lot of cases on Reddit, it's always Reddit, where people have, pitched the thing that they want to write and they're asking, oh, should I do this? And very often it's an AU inspired by a video game using the same characters, or it's, oh, well, I want to take this book, but I want to do this, and the book is pretty recent. It's not a classic or a fairy tale, for example. And I always go, well, that's just fan fiction. You can't write that, and you certainly legally cannot publish it. And I will say, caveat, in some cases, so if you have been inspired by something modern or recent or under copyright, and you're just, you're bugged by the way that they did something and you want to do it differently, you would write the story very, very differently. You can absolutely be inspired by current and modern media properties and write your own book, but don't call it a retelling. Write the thing, do as much work, and it does take work to hide the seams of the original inspiration so that it is not knockoff fanfic, and just be inspired to write an original story. There are lots of good examples of this, and one of my favorite recent ones is Defy the Stars by Claudia Gray. I went to an event with Claudia at DragonCon, and she told us that she was actually inspired by the movie Prometheus. She was intrigued and inspired by the character David, but didn't like what they did with him, and so he was the inspiration for this entire book, Defy the Stars. But this is not fan fiction. It's completely normal to be inspired by other media properties, but let's get into the meat of actual retellings. So first off, a little cheat tip, at their heart, all retellings are fan fiction. I say this as a former fanfic writer, and again as someone who loves fan fiction, so lean in and embrace that side of yourself. And I will also say to people who have done retellings, who turn their nose down at fan fiction, that I see you. You're writing fan fiction, sir. You are writing fan fiction. But of course we don't label it fan fiction. We label them retellings. And typically this is when you're taking a classic story, a classic novel that is out of copyright, a fairy tale, a myth, or what have you, and you are retelling that story, but you're twisting it, you're transplanting it into a new setting, you're changing characters. I covered it in the What Makes a Good Retelling video, all the things that you can consider and do to make your retelling interesting and fresh. And there's the word, fresh. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to choosing the story to retell is that you have to consider the market. What has been done? First of all, the genre that you're writing in. I'm going to mostly be talking about YA because that is my area of expertise, and oh boy, there's a lot of retellings in YA, so you have a lot to contend with. A couple years ago, Epic Reads came out with a cheat sheet of retellings. It's this really gorgeous graphic. So I definitely recommend Googling that. I will actually drop a link to that down below as a starting point, though it is out of date as of, I believe, 3 or 4 years ago. So it doesn't even have all of the retellings that have come out since then, and there have been a lot. So you have to look at what has been published. Is the story that you want to retell oversaturated in the market? if there are 3, 4, 5 books that have come out recently, and I'd say recent, you should go back as far as 5, 7, 10 years ago, only in the sense that some books that are older have a wide kind of birth, a repercussion, because if they did well, they'll be so fresh to people in their minds that your retelling will seem unnecessary or like a rehash. You do have to look at what everyone is doing. You basically want to avoid retelling fatigue, which is where a story has been retold or done so many times recently that readers can't necessarily tell them apart, or most of them haven't sold well, and therefore agents and editors simply are not going to want another one. So on the flip side, if you've got a story and no one's done it, you should always ask yourself, why? Is it because, just no one has figured out how to do it and you are the brilliant genius who is going to crack that open and write a beautiful retelling? Do it. But also consider that maybe there's a reason that certain stories haven't been retold in your genre, for example. Maybe those stories aren't adaptable to your genre. Like YA, for example. There are some stories that I just don't think work transplanted into a YA environment. Or it could be that the property is so obscure that no one is going to care. And in this case, I'm going to give you the same advice that I gave you for those modern media properties that you are inspired by. If you are retelling something super duper obscure that isn't commercial, and saying that it's a retelling of X isn't going to offer you a hook as a pitch, just don't pitch it as a retelling of that story. You can still retell that story, but you want to put forward the most interesting and original aspects of your story so that it stands on its own, and so that you're essentially selling it on its own merit and not as a retelling. Sometimes that is the best option if the thing that you are retelling is either really, really obscure, or also sometimes if the thing that you are retelling has been done a lot. If you are creative enough and can hide the seams of your retelling, maybe you can get away with not billing it as a retelling of that story. Something to think about. Now I want to talk about the law. Aren't you excited? So, disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. I do not have any legal training, but I am generally familiar with copyright and fair use law because I come from the wonderful world of fan fiction and fandom. I'm very good friends with the awesome Heidi Tandy, who runs the F Yeah copyright blog. So I have so many friends who are copyright and fair use nerds. Another friend of mine, Casey Fiesler, studies it as well, that I've always had copyright and fair use in the back of my head. So the sweet spot for you doing a retelling is going to be the public domain. This means that a story is out of copyright and is in the public domain, so that means anyone can do a retelling or use elements of that thing without having to pay anyone and get the licensing rights to do so. Most older books are automatically in the public domain, with just a couple of notable exceptions, but for the most part, this is why classics are a very good place to go. And by classics, I mean novels published before, say, 1900, because the vast majority of them are out of copyright. So you can retell a Jane Austen story until the cows come home. I did Jane Eyre because these are public domain stories. Fairy tales and myths are also typically in the public domain, except I want to talk about Disney a bit. So I've noticed a trend of people, often my age and a little bit younger, being inspired by Disney movies. These are the movies that we have grown up with, especially with the Disney Renaissance that started in the 80s and continued through to the 90s, took a break, and then came back full force in the late 2000s, Tangled made everything better. Here's the thing. Disney movies are retellings. Disney movies are actually quite clever, and I highly recommend reading some of the original stories and then watching the Disney movie again and looking at all of the things that are essentially original to the Disney movie. When Disney takes a fairy tale or myth, they always make pretty substantial changes to it. First of all, they change things to make it fit the Disney brand very often, also to speak to the modern audience, but One big thing that Disney does all the time is that they make changes to make the stories fit 3-act structure and to give them a traditional external, like big bad villain type. They make changes to essentially introduce more conflict into the stories. And so some of the most beloved elements of Disney movies, Disney fairy tales, the ones that many writers I see them trying to riff on, are actually not under the public domain. Those specific elements are trademarked to Disney. So you cannot do, for example, you couldn't do a retelling of The Little Mermaid with Ursula as your main character because Ursula was invented by Disney. The Sea Witch, of course, exists in the original Little Mermaid fairy tale, but her name is not Ursula. And she doesn't have the finer details of being an octopus and all of that stuff. And the whole 3rd act of The Little Mermaid, where Ursula, using Ariel's voice necklace, goes up and like steals Eric, none of that happens in the original Little Mermaid. So you cannot do a retelling of that, and so at least not bill it as that. Again, if you remove enough of the seams, like, sewing, you can get away with some things, but that is because Disney's not gonna let you publish that. Similarly, another really good example, did you know that Gaston was an invention of Disney? He's one of the best parts of Beauty and the Beast from a conflict and stakes point of view, does not exist in the original fairy tale, so Gaston is also completely off limits. So what this means is if you are inspired by Disney movies, you have to simply be inspired by them. You often cannot do an actual retelling of the Disney movie. If you want to retell the same fairy tale, that is completely fine. They're in the public domain, but you're gonna have to go to the original, read the original and riff off of that, just as Disney riffed off the original themselves. And I really kind of already touched on it, but just another reminder that you are not going to be writing a retelling of recent media properties. You don't get to retell Harry Potter. That is not a thing. You don't get to retell the Avengers. These are all trademarked and copyrighted properties, and also just too recent to need a retelling. So just be really wary of those things. Now, I would like to go over a few properties that are weird exceptions when it comes to copyright and fair use. And I should define fair use. Fair use applies to transformative works. You're able to sample and borrow from existing media properties. Up to a certain point, you can kind of use them as your inspiration. Like fan fiction is fair use. Parody videos are fair use. When it falls out of the purview of fair use is when you try to sell those things. That is why you do not get to sell your fan fiction. You do not have the right to do so. So mostly here we are talking about copyright. And here's the thing, you can't copyright an idea. That's really important to know, and that's why I am encouraging you in some cases that you are allowed to be inspired by something, though always ask yourself, at what point is it inspiration, and at what point are you writing something that is derivative and too close to fan fiction? Like, you don't get to be inspired by Harry Potter and write, a magical society with a boarding school and a chosen one, because at that point, like, what are you really adding? But I digress. We're not gonna go off on that tangent, but you can't copyright ideas. So two kind of weird exceptions. So Peter Pan you would think fall into public domain because of the age of the work, but it does not, because of this weird situation where Barry left the rights of Peter Pan to a hospital in the UK. He left the rights to the Great Ormond Street Hospital in the UK, and they are the rights holders for Peter Pan, and so they are the ones who license and give permission to people to adapt it. Though I do actually recommend reading their FAQs page on their website, because they actually do give some examples of cases where works that I would call retellings do not fall under their purview. They were under fair use. So for example, they cited that Pan, the movie that was not good by director Joe Wright, they did not license that because it was essentially a prequel using the characters, and so it didn't fall under their domain. So that movie did not need to be licensed by the great Ormond Street Hospital, which I just think is really, really interesting. Also, Sherlock Holmes. You're actually all clear on Sherlock Holmes at this time, but that wasn't always the case. Sherlock Holmes used to be under trust. There was an estate that held the rights to Sherlock Holmes, and they were very litigious, and they would make things really, really difficult for people because there was a loophole in estate law. But that all got solved when they got sued for being overly litigious about going after people about Sherlock Holmes adaptations and retelling, so have at it with Sherlock Holmes. I just wanted to give you those few examples because I find them really interesting, and they're just examples where it is not cut and dry that, oh, something's old, so you could automatically retell it with impunity. You should always do your due diligence of looking up whether or not you have the right to retell something. So similarly, that I think it comes up as well, classic TV shows and movies. In some cases, they might fall into the public domain depending on how long it has been. In other cases, I just would encourage you to err on the side of inspiration rather than retelling anything that comes from like the latter half of the 20th century, just to be safe. So just for fun, I want to share a short but not exhaustive or prescriptive list of stories that I think are kind of oversaturated. So if you're thinking of retelling these stories, I would encourage you to not? That's not true. I just would encourage you to go in with your eyes open that these stories have been retold a lot, and that if you are choosing to rewrite them, you have to bring something really fresh and new and interesting to the table. There's always exceptions with things. You know, people say it's oversaturated, and then you prove them wrong by doing a bang-up job. But some of those titles are Beauty and the Beast, Snow White, Cinderella, Pride and Prejudice, Peter Pan, Sherlock Holmes, Romeo and Juliet, and Alice in Wonderland. Again, this doesn't mean don't do them, but I have seen a lot of them on the market. So if you are looking to approach these stories, think, maybe I don't want to do a straight retelling, maybe I can just be inspired by, or get really, really creative and bring new angles and ideas to your retelling. I hope this was helpful for you if you're thinking about doing a retelling. I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about the line between retelling and fan fiction, between retelling and just inspiration, some of the legal things that you should consider, and definitely market and market saturation. I think that's really important to consider. The key with retellings is to be as fresh as possible, to both capitalize on people's excitement for something that they want to read a retelling of it, but also not retreading too much ground where other writers have already covered, mined the source material for all of the best gems. So leave any questions or comments down below. I would love to hear what you guys are working on, if you're doing a retelling, some of your favorite retellings. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. It always helps me know kind of what content you guys want to see more of. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I would love and appreciate a subscription. I post new videos 2 to 3 times a week all about craft, writing, getting traditionally published, and especially the YA book market. So thank you so much for watching, and happy writing, everyone.